Okay, good morning. We're going to start. I was waking up this morning. I went to bed somewhat late yesterday, and the first thought I got when I woke up is, what am I doing here? And it's all, as a matter of fact, this has one responsible person who is now my good friend, Tuyeni Wampamba, who works in Mexico at the Institute of Research on Ecosystems and Sustainability, who decided to organize this discussion, this debate. And she invited me to moderate it, and in a very responsible manner, I said yes. And so I'm here now moderating something I don't really know too much about. Tuyeni is down there, but is going to come up if things go awry. It was born in Romania, but lived almost all her young years in Tanzania. She's from a Romanian mother and a Tanzanian father, and has a really good knowledge on community management of tropical forests, and that's on which she has devoted her research. She did a bachelor's degree in Mount Holyoke in Massachusetts, and a PhD in the University of California, Davis. She came to Mexico for a postdoc at the Center for Environmental Geography, and finally decided to stay in Morelia in the Institute of Ecosystem Research. Her area of expertise is ecosystem services and management in managed forests, and the community management of tropical forests outside protected areas. And she has personally an interest in the issue of permits and the management of wildlife trade, and recommended and suggested this discussion. Probably one of the reasons why Tuyeni called me is because I had the very unfortunate experience of being scientific chair of CITES in year 1994, and I'm being serious now, I'm not being facetious at all. It's very complicated to be chair a CITES meeting. Really, countries come with mandates from their federal government, and they come to get things, to achieve things, to get permits, to list some plants or some animals, or to delist them. And it's really one of those conventions in which everything is contentious. The whole debate in CITES is always awfully contentious. And now, as a researcher, after that brief experience in international governance, as a researcher in the United States, but a researcher from Mexico, I have to deal all the time with the movement of plant specimens and animal specimens across the border. And I have a lot of questions myself about how effective this is, and how have we perhaps organized a system that forces scientists to lie, because if you try very often, our legal regulations are so complicated that, and sometimes so devoid of really research rationality, that if we follow them to the letter, it becomes almost impossible to do by national research. So there's a lot of questions around CITES. At the same time, I have to confess myself that I'm convinced that in some cases has been very, very effective. And it has actually, I believe, produce interesting and effective results in regulating wildlife trade. But in many other cases, I have some doubts that it has been able to do so. The title of the roundtable today, of the debate today, talks about our trade and hunting bans on endangered tropical species, a quote-unquote perfect storm for poaching or an effective conservation strategy. And the perfect storm makes, of course, reference to a number of the failed attempts to regulate, and the differences between countries to regulate things like, for example, the ivory trade or the rhino horn black market, and many of these things that are well-known examples of issues where the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species has actually not had a lot of teeth, not actually had a lot of effective results, and where some people are wondering if all this if it's going in the right direction. So, today we have two wonderful speakers that actually know about this and know a lot about this. Let me start with Annecoos Wiersema. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah.
For short, Anna. I will call you Anna from now onwards.
Yes.
It's easier for me. Anna has a doctorate in the science of law, an SJD. SJD in 2004 from Harvard University. She has a bachelor in law from 1998 from the London School of Economics. Originally, Anna comes from the United Kingdom, although she's now in the United States, and a BA from the University of Southampton. Her area of expertise is international environmental law, with particular emphasis on international wildlife trade, biodiversity conservation, and forest conservation. And she is currently in the Sturm College of Law at the University of Denver in the state of Colorado in the United States. On my left, we have Duan Biggs, who was born in Namibia, did most of his studies in South Africa, if I got that right. He has a PhD from the Center for Coral Reef Studies in James Cook University. He has been always interested in the impact on coral reefs and then on many other ecosystems of tourism. He did a postdoc on conservation and tourism in South Africa national parks, and also worked in Chile for a year on the impact of tourism on marine ecosystems. At the same time, or around that time, he also worked in South Africa on the legal wildlife trade crisis, and eventually he moved to Australia, where he has a position in Griffith University, is research fellow at the Environmental Futures Research Institute, and has done a lot of work on the international trade of endangered species. So we have two heavyweights that actually know about the subject, and I will start now posing three questions, and I believe we have to vote on them with a little cell phone thing, isn't it? We have three questions here. The first question is, do trade bans work, or do they detonate illegal trade that can drive species to extinction? Which is what I was trying to pose as a question a little while ago. Actually, do these bans work, or are they actually favoring illegality? What some people and friends have described, if you try to do the paperwork right, you actually get your head out of the trench, and you are an easy target for the legal system. If you do it completely illegally, nobody sees you, law enforcement is very complicated, and you actually might do better. So the question is, do trade bans work, or are they favoring illegality? And we have three possible answers. A, they work. B, they don't work. And C, I don't actually know enough to answer the question. So what happens now? Shall I give them a minute or something for them to answer? Okay. Oh, I can see it here. That's nice. So most of the people that have answered are unsure. I have to agree, I'm unsure myself. Second question we have is, millions of people in tropical regions depend on bushmeat and wild foods to meet their calorie and nutrient intake. When this is sourced from endangered species, should existing bans on harvest, trade, and consumption still apply? So the question is, regulations like CITES, should they apply strictly only for international trade, and we should leave traditional communities on their own, hunting the way they have forever, or should stricter bans apply also at the community level? The answers are A, yes, or B, no. So should we apply hunting bans also on local communities? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Shall I keep on going?
Oh, here.
Oh, there it is.
Here we are. Okay, it seems to be stabilizing around that. 64% for yes, and some 35, 36%, 35 now for no. The last question before I give the floor to the speakers is a question that we all ask ourselves and on which I personally have a mixed answer. Many countries argue in international agreements and conventions like CITES that they have developed the ability to farm endangered species. Like, for example, countries in South America, Paraguay, Argentina, claim that they're able to farm tupinambis, which is a big reptile that has very nice colored skin that is used to make cowboy boots. In Texas, the whole industry of cowboy boots depends to a large extent on tupinambi hides. And I've wondered, knowing those environments, are they really farming tupinambis, or is the excuse that they can farm them opening the door for people to hunt tupinambis because now it's legal to hunt them, and it's very difficult to distinguish a farmed hide from an unfarmed hide from a wild one. There are many, many other examples. For example, in Mexico, we have this problem with cacti. If some organizations argue that they are selling farmed cacti, and I work in arid zones, I very often have the feeling that those are not farmed cacti, that there are really wild cacti using the excuse of farming to be able to trade them. So the question is it acceptable to domesticate unfarmed endangered species ex situ in ranches and zoos with the finality of consuming them? And the responses are A, yes, and B, no. So I'll say it again. Is it acceptable to domesticate and farm, basically to trade endangered species that have been in principle brought up ex situ in ranches and zoos with the finality of consuming them? A, yes, B, no. Nice. Okay. I didn't give the option of it depends on the species. You did, didn't you, to Yenny? To Yenny's there in the backstage doing things. But thank you to Yenny. I very much agree with that, as a matter of fact. It's a good option. Okay. So, having done all this, I've done my homework. Now I will sit and proceed to shut up, and we're going to give the floor to the two debaters.
To Duan first.
I think you should go first, Anna.
We had agreed that Duan
Oh,
would go first.
that Duan? we had agreed?
We had agreed.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right?
I'm getting definitely senile.
Right?
Duan, we
Yes,
had
but that is
agreed,
what
man.
we
We had agreed
agreed.
that you have the floor. So
I mean, you're in the
please-
chair. Do I need to push a button here, or is this on?
No, it will be. I think if you push it once, it will be on.
All right.
Yeah, there you are.
Okay.
Go for it,
I
Duan.
can't really see the clock. I'll lean over to see when I'm running out of time. So thank you to Yenny and to the organizing committee for inviting us over here to this fascinating debate, and for organizing a fascinating conference at this lovely venue. And it's great to be here. So I'm arguing today that trade and hunting bans are implemented in a way that often creates the perfect storm for poaching. And I've left out the word endangered in that title, and I'll explain later why. So trade and hunting bans are an important part of the conservation toolkit. Sometimes you need them, but these are special cases. They are a special tool and they need to be implemented carefully. Often at the moment, they're being implemented as the best or only solution, or even it's a policy victory. Just getting a trade ban declared, yay, we won, without consideration of the complexity involved in implementation. This does create a perfect storm for poaching and has all sorts of unintended consequences for conservation and society more broadly, particularly in countries that I come from, like South Africa and Namibia. So you're all scientists in this room. I'm sure you're wondering, well, why? Why do you say this? So one of the key reasons for this has to do with, as Exequiel started touching on, the shortcomings of CITES. CITES is one of the earliest multilateral environmental agreements. It came into force in 1975. Yes, it was needed at the time, but it hasn't really changed that much since then, and the world has changed a lot. Also, our thinking about how we need to go about managing environmental issues has advanced a lot since then, and this is not reflected in CITES. For example, anyone who runs conservation projects today knows that you need a theory of change. What's your theory of change to impact, to achieve a conservation outcome? CITES does not have a theory of change. Oh, there's too many species too many of this population being poached, let's impose a ban. No need to think through the assumptions as to which step is going to lead to which outcome and to which ultimate impact. There's no consideration of costs. Who bears the cost burden and the likelihood of successful implementation of decisions? Landscape conservation and maintaining ecosystem integrity is also not considered. And the social complexities of CITES decisions, such as bans, are also not considered. Oops. Also, an important issue is that bans, as implemented today, often contradict science and the best knowledge we have. So this is a Nobel-winning economist, the late Lynn Ostrom, and she and her research team over many decades developed an understanding of the principles for the sustainable management of resources by communities and for their investment in long-term protection. There are many principles she's developed. Some of the really key ones are that local communities need to be given rights and benefits over natural resources like wildlife, and external parties, NGOs, donors need to support those communities in developing their own rules and enforcing those rules. Now, trade and hunting bans as they're being implemented at the moment are doing exactly the opposite. The CITES parties, 183 of them, vote that, okay, we should have a trade ban on this. Or in some cases, if it's a hunting import ban, the United States decides no more imports of elephant trophies from Zimbabwe. The communities, the landholders, the conservancies, the conservation areas affected are not consulted. And according to Lynn Ostrom's work, the current trade bans that are often poorly enforced in the case of trade bans lead to the worst outcome of all. And that is that you have externally imposed rules that the people affected by those rules do not necessarily think are legitimate, do not agree with, and this also crowds out communities and societies that live with these resources to actually develop their own rules for managing them sustainably. So I'm going to give some data and examples about how this is manifested in the continent. I do most of my work in Africa by comparing trends in wildlife numbers between 3 southern African countries, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, with Kenya. And these two parts of Africa have had different policies. So from the 1970s, South Africa, Namibia, and Zimbabwe had a transfer of ownership of wildlife to private landholders and rural community groups. Communities and landholders could use, hunt, sell, and breed up wildlife as they chose to. The results from a conservation perspective have been very impressive. In Zimbabwe, elephant numbers on communal land increased from 4,000 to 21,000. Nearly 1 million participating households and over 200,000 square kilometers of conservation area created. Namibia, similar types of benefits, more than a doubling of elephant numbers, vast areas of land conserved that conserves not only your large mammals like elephants, all sorts of other species and taxa, and lots of jobs created. In South Africa, the numbers of large mammals increased from 600,000 in the 1960s to over 6 million more recently as a result of these policies and systems. Now, let's look at Kenya. This is comparing the 1977 to 1980 to the late 1990s and to more recently. As you can see, all large mammals are suffering significant declines, up to nearly 90%, and domestic livestock increasing. Now, an economist would tell you, well, that's kind of what you would expect if the government, like in Kenya, owns all the wildlife. Communities, landholders do not own the wildlife. They have no right to use it, to sell it, to hunt it. They're going to probably look to invest in something they have ownership over. Now, one of the issues that was raised was, what is, are we willing to domesticate animals or farm them ex situ? Now, I know for some species this is an issue where it's a clear zoo-like operation of breeding, but in the systems I work with, the line between what is a wild mammal in a national park and what is a branched mammal on a private game reserve is very blurry. Both of these animals would be actively managed either by the park authority or by the private game reserve owner. And so that's a very blurry line that often gets lost. And the CITES definitions of farmed versus ranched animals are not designed for private landowners with wildlife to contribute to the conservation of populations within their natural range. So finally, and I mentioned the word endangered was not in the title. And so and this is why, if we think about what's getting the most attention in the media, in CITES discussions, the over $1 billion that has been made available to combat the illegal wildlife trade since 2011, it's gone to rhino, elephant, our big mammals that are iconic. As you can see from the slide, those species are not even endangered. They're vulnerable, or in the case of white rhino, near threatened. So we're spending all our time and energy debating about bans and trying to implement trade bans on these species, whereas other species, such as species of orchids perhaps, that are actually critically endangered and are being openly sold in markets in countries like Thailand, there's very little interest in taking action on. So to conclude, trade and hunting bans do have an important role to play, but they're very specialized policy tools, and they're not being implemented correctly at the moment. We are often focused on the wrong species, and the way these bans are being implemented at the moment often leads to a perfect storm for poaching. And a number of acknowledgements to people that I've worked with in this space.
Thank you, Duan. Thank you very much, Duan. We're going to give the floor now to Anne. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here this morning. I don't have a PowerPoint slide, which is the first sign that I'm a law professor, not a scientist. But hopefully my comments will be clear enough. So I'm going to explain a few of the reasons why I think that trade bans can be an effective tool and are sometimes necessary for some species, not all species. And I'm not going to talk about CITES. I think CITES is a somewhat complex regime now with all of the years of work of the parties. It has two tiers. One is regulated trade and one is a ban on trade. But I'm not going to focus on that because I'm really thinking about the role of trade bans, whether it's under CITES or anything else. It's a complex question. It's dependent on a number of variables. I'm going to speak at a level of generality because I'm really talking about figuring out what those variables might be, and I don't have a lot of time. So the first one is that it's important to remember that the market itself is one of the variables. So the species is a variable, right? How iconic it is may be one of those variables, but more important, the biology of the species, whether it can be farmed or ranched, whether it reproduces, whether it has to be killed for the product, ivory versus rhino horn, for example. But the market is also a very important variable here. We can distinguish, for example, between a community's use of a species, perhaps for subsistence, provided that they have some monitoring, and they may need external help for that, but they may be able to do it themselves. We can distinguish that from another category, which might be trophy hunting, which in itself can be managed by communities. It isn't always managed by communities, and it isn't always well managed in terms of conservation and populations, but it can be. And at some level, the participants in the market are limited because not everybody can afford to fly in and spend the money. So we might be able to do that. The third category I would talk about that is important to focus on is international markets, where the demand is diffuse. It's not necessarily for durable goods. It doesn't go through manufacturers, for example, like leather fashion manufacturers, but the examples are, we can think of shark fin soup that is increasingly consumed by families, rhino horn that's consumed, conspicuous consumption, just mixed in with a little water. It's supposed to now be a hangover cure, potentially more. That can be consumed over and over again and is consumed by vast quantities of people, is traveling across multiple borders to get there. And I think we have to think about whether we can control that market. The second thing we have to think about and pay attention to is the question of demand and what trade bans or legalizing trade does to demand. Demand isn't static. It's not static at all. It generally goes up with legalization. We've seen this in the wake of sales of ivory post-2008, increasing reemergence of ivory carvers in China. We've also seen new uses being marketed and developed in Vietnam for rhino horn. I have an example in Colorado, or in the US generally. For every state that is legalizing marijuana, they see an increase in demand. That may be okay if supply can keep up, but demand does go up. But demand can also go down, and it's a mistake to think that it can't. It goes down sometimes with campaigns, and increasingly we have, I say we, I don't mean I just mean generally society has behavioral scientists working on this. Government policy affects what people do, and stigma is a very important thing too. But it's also important for consumers to be able to figure out what is legal and illegal, because consumers in the United States, when they buy timber, generally don't know what is a problem and what is not. And that is true across the board. If we have a ban, it's easier to work on those things. It's still hard, but it's easier. If we don't have a ban, we significantly complicate the message. So then we get into a moral question of whether we should be addressing demand. Who are some people to tell other people what they can and cannot do? Not all uses of wildlife products are traditional uses. Many of them are newly created. We live in a world of marketing, so marketing plays an incredibly important role. But in addition, we don't always allow continued use of symbolic items. The United States, there are a number of people in the United States who would claim that their love of SUVs and trucks is a symbolic demonstration of their freedom as Americans, and if they're taxed too much on gasoline, they may just show their irritation at the polls. But that doesn't mean that it's bad for us to try to convince people to modify their behavior because we're concerned about climate change. And to be more stark about it, we try to change people's behavior when it comes to smoking. We try to change people's behavior certainly when it comes to activity we think is outside of what is acceptable. Child abuse is one example. Third, there's an argument that allowing for legalized trade can generate revenue for conservation. And I think this is one where I would say we really need to study this, because what is often left out of the proposals for legalization is what will be needed in terms of a regulatory system to manage that. It can be done. It's being done in these states in the US that are legalizing marijuana. But it takes some revenue and it takes enforcement. At the same time, you don't really reduce your enforcement officers, your number of police. You don't fire police because you've now legalized something, and you're certainly not going to get rid of all the customs officials who are monitoring for other illegal trade. There are costs then with this regulatory system, and you can't capture all the benefits through taxes, because if it's too expensive, you're simply going to drive everything underground again, and you will not have achieved the goal, which is to open up a legal market that can replace the black market. I do think it can be done, but for any species that is traded, you need to think carefully about the regulatory system. The other piece of that revenue aspect is the concern that you could be externalizing the costs, right? There's enforcement now because you have legal products and illegal products, and that enforcement effort has to take place on the ground in the states where things are being bought, which is why the actual market, going back to my first point, is relevant. The demand states will have to police this more. It may be harder for them. There are other states who may be more susceptible to poaching, who also will have increased enforcement costs. These are all things that have to be examined and thought about. I'm out of time, so I'll end there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, by the way, both speakers. That was really interesting and stimulating. I have here 4 questions that have been organized by the convener. And I will give them separately and give each of you a chance to respond to it. You should, on average, although I'm not really taking too much control of time, we're doing well, so be relaxed. But aim like in 2-3 minutes at the most, give some ideas to each of the questions. The first one is something that has already sort of cropped up in the answers at the beginning, which is how species specific these permits are, and these controls can be. And the particular question that was prepared by Tuyeni is, how does the characteristics of the species, or how do the characteristics of the species affect the debate? Meaning, of course, are we actually regulating the correct species, or are we aiming more for iconic species? And then, of course, as I mentioned, I personally get the impression that some species actually can be regulated quite well in the international trade because they're easy to identify, border patrols can recognize them very easily, etc. But others are really complicated. And most of our border control systems do not have the scientific expertise to tell them apart and to to figure out the difference between llama wool and vicuña wool. And one is perfectly tradable, and the other is controlled by CITES. So how much does the characteristic of a species affect the debate about potential trade control? And again, Duan, you have the floor.
Right, I'll try and keep it to 2 minutes. I see I have 5. Very nice. Is this on? Yes. So I think that, is this on or not? Yes, thank you. I mean, as Anne also mentioned, the characteristics of the species are essential. I think, as I pointed out in my slides, one of the challenges with the current debates is that we're focusing on the iconic species and the ones that get people excited, not necessarily the ones that are the most endangered. And I think there's definitely, so crocodilians, for example, have a very successful trade, and actually that's an example of where a trade ban was necessary to stabilize populations, and that enabled the institutions and the mechanisms to be put in place for illegal trade, and then that that was successful. And that's well managed and works very well across a wide range of countries, including countries that many people would say have very poor governance and are highly corrupt, like Venezuela, Papua New Guinea, Zimbabwe. So I think, and I mean, those characteristics are important. Certainly, as Anne mentioned as well, you know, the rhino and elephant, even though if you look at the debates in CITES, you know, the same arguments are being used against the rhino horn trade as are being used against the ivory trade, but rhino horn, you can get up to 13 horns from one rhino. You know, it's live harvest, it's a renewable harvest, whereas elephants are different. That's a very different commodity. No, so I do think that certainly the characteristics of the species are very important. A colleague of mine, Jacob Phelps, put out a paper in 2015 summarizing these, you know, with respect to plants. How quickly can you cultivate them? Can you cultivate them at a price that competes with the market price? What is the enforceability like? So I think these are all issues. I do want to, just before my time is up, raise one point that is often repeated that I would like to see evidence of, because I've looked everywhere but not found it, and that is the point that legalization leads to an increase in demand. That is a point that's brought up in many of these debates. It's brought up in CITES. Now, as far as I'm aware, and I've been working on publications on this intensively, the 2008 ivory sale, the balance of evidence is clear. That is not the reason for the increased poaching. There's only one working paper that suggests that that's been refuted by the majority of scholars. But if there is evidence, I would love to know. I have not seen any from legalization of alcohol, after prohibition, from decriminalization of drugs, so I would like to see that.
I can find you and send you certainly numbers from legalization of marijuana in the US and even after prohibition in the United States. Prohibition of alcohol, consumption went up after that ended. That's fine, I like some alcohol, but...
Right.
But yes, there is some data out there. I agree that the question of ivory is disputed, right? What was the cause of increased poaching of ivory? I will say, and then I'll go back to your question, that does raise a question, you know, if we try something, how are we going to know, or are we ever going to be willing to attribute some increase in poaching to the legalization? So it's a problem of whether this is a sort of, you know, fixed path that you end up being on, and it doesn't actually allow for adaptivity, to be adaptive. You also have invested stakeholders. But that's a separate point. That's not the question that was asked, so I apologize. To go back to the question of species characteristics, yes, absolutely. They're very significant in the sense, as Duan said, in the sense that, you know, some things that are demanded can be harvested from ranched species. Some things can be harvested, but with real concerns about that. For example, bear bile. And some things require killing, and for some species they can regenerate sufficiently that that's okay. But I would add what I said in my main comments, which is that the market itself and the demand is also highly significant here, and sometimes the iconic nature of the species feeds into that. And in fact, the iconic nature of the species can make it more complicated to have a legal product and get substitutability, because if you are looking to consume tiger products for virility, which is not the only thing that they're consumed for, but one of the things, then it may be easier, it may be better to try and have the wild produced product. It's also cheaper, actually, sadly, to get, in some instances, to get a poached tiger than to get one from a breeding facility. So to sum up, the species characteristics are very critical, but the market itself is also critical. And I don't think we can make blanket assumptions about what will happen without paying very careful attention to what something is being used for and thinking carefully about whether that demand can be sustained, and if it increases, what do we do about it?
Thank you very much, Anne. We'll go to the second question, on which Duan in some way has already touched upon when he talked about Lynn Armstrong's ideas on community level governance and the interests of local communities on natural resources. And having been in a number of CITES conventions and having chaired one, as a matter of fact, I get the impression that very often there is some unbalance in the way things are discussed. First of all, among nations, there are countries that are powerful, economically powerful. They have a strong voice in these regulations and these international discussions. They have very good advisory committees or technical staff that provides hardcore information. And so their voice is very strongly heard, and then there are countries whose voice is not so strongly heard. So there are differences among nations in the way they can have an incidence or decide about what can be permitted in trade and what cannot be permitted in trade. And then, of course, within countries, there is this hidden difference also. What the representation in the United Nations, in CITES, for example, of a country says or doesn't necessarily reflect the opinions and the perspectives of the communities that form that country. So even within a country, there is also a bias in perceptions and interests, and again, the official representation of the country doesn't necessarily bring to the discussion table the community perspective within those countries. So the question is about the role of power and power relationships and north-south dynamics in deciding what can be traded and what should not be traded. What is acceptable to hunt and what is not acceptable to hunt. So that's the question, and except if you want to change, I was giving the floor first to Duan. Is that okay?
You can go first if you'd
Okay.
like to.
I don't mind, but yes, okay. So power dynamics, we could be here a long time. I absolutely agree there are power dynamics, very strong power dynamics that operate within CITES and operate generally even in the work of non-governmental organizations that play a huge part, of course, in conservation and are driven by donor funding and donor demands that are not always based on scientific needs. So there are certainly power dynamics. Unfortunately, we don't have a system that allows for multilateral decision-making that is better than the international community coming together and voting. And the alternative would be to devolve everything to local communities. At that point, I have to come back to the externalities point. And I also just put on the table, if our starting position is that we want to avoid extinction of species, and I accept not all of the species we're talking about are at the level of endangered under IUCN, but nevertheless, we're trying to avoid extinction of species, that's going to color the values that are addressed. But of course, not all the states, when they're in a multilateral discussion, are thinking only about species. I don't think that means we have to back off from that. But I think it's also much more complex than just north-south dynamics. I've been in a CITES meeting where states voted after many years to list certain shark species on Appendix 2, and although the ballot was secret, a number of range states made the choice to say that they had voted for the Appendix 2 listing, which requires regulation of trade and monitoring, because they didn't want other countries coming in and taking their resources, and they referred to China specifically. Now, China isn't the biggest demand state actually for wildlife products, but it's important to remember that there are power dynamics within the South as well. And then, of course, As our moderator said, there are power dynamics within countries. Local communities don't always have the same goals or gain from the interests of the state. And when we talk about markets for species, we're also having to get into questions about privatization and who will benefit, who will capture the benefits of this public resource. It's not always the local communities. If we want it to be, and I think it should be, of course, then we really have to pay attention to that and make sure that we're structuring the regulatory system so that they are the ones that benefit and that they have primary control. And I absolutely support that. But I think we have to recognize that they may not always have full information. Thanks.
Thank you. I certainly agree with your point on need to be very careful if we do legalize the trade in any species, to make sure the people that are actually living and bearing the costs of living with those species benefit from that. In terms of the CITES structure, I mean, some of Lynn Ostrom's work points to polycentricity, so multi-layered institutions which do provide some indication of a direction CITES could move in, but from my experience in CITES and talking to the gurus and experts there's no appetite to change anything, and so politically it's probably not going to happen. So we're going to have to, for the time being, work with the status quo. We actually, as part of my role in the IUCN, proposed a formal mechanism for communities to have a greater voice in CITES, and it was met with quite a lot of resistance. It had support from African countries, but the United States actually stood up, Israel stood up and said, look, this is not the fora for this. This is not where local communities should have a voice, necessarily. You know, that's in other conventions. So that was certainly, there was opposition to that. In terms of other power dynamics, I think something that's, there's certainly an issue of the kind of the global urban elite who are quite far removed from nature, do not hunt, you know, watch Discovery Channel or National Geographic, but actually have the money to fund a lot of the NGOs that are quite powerful in these discussions, but are quite far removed from the consequences and are quite powerful politically. And they definitely have a lot more power in these discussions than the rural people who bear the costs of these policy decisions. And that's also an important issue that particularly some African countries have raised is, you know, the EU, the United States is dictating to South Africa what it can and cannot do with its rhinos, but it forces South Africa to bear the costs. And that's a power dynamic in itself. And I think a last point here, and this is something that people that have been in the conservation arena for much longer have mentioned to me, is that the animal rights movement, you know, people who believe that individual animals have the right to not be hunted, and we should stop that or not be traded. They've penetrated the conservation rhetoric. And so if you look at the position of a lot of mainstream NGOs, they've shifted in that direction, and the rhetoric overall has shifted in that direction. And that's another power dynamic that's at play.
Thank you, Duan. The next question has to do with something, if I can tell you a short anecdote. Sven Lindblad, the founder of Lindblad Expeditions, that does ecological tourism in many parts of the world, is a stout defender of the Charles Darwin Research Station in the Galapagos Islands. And I was once talking with him, and he gave me an idea that I thought it was really interesting. He said, you know, never underestimate the power of young researchers or young students going around in zodiacs, dressed in khaki with some funny cap on their head, like the one that Miguel just gave me, and doing research. He said that creates a whole environment around conservation. And he said that he had seen examples where poaching or conservation challenges have been tried to enforce through armed forces, the Navy, the Army, the police, and failed. And then suddenly you had a group of researchers from the local universities or from international universities going there. Just their presence and their passion and what they're doing and their articulation of ideas changed the whole environment. And he said, whatever has been done well in the Galapagos and with all the problems that the Galapagos has is because of these young people going around. And he said, I don't even care what they publish or what they don't publish. Just have them going around and talking with people and doing research has changed the whole outlook to conservation. I thought that was a very powerful idea. And so the question, in very much that line, the question that Tuyeni has posed is, could you please elaborate on the role of conservation biologists and conservation practitioners, not necessarily researchers, in this debate? And I will add to that the last question, so we'll merge the two, which is, together with that, could you please discuss or detect the main research gaps to be filled in all these issues about the trade of endangered species and the controlling, or at least the promotion of some measures that would improve the level of conservation of species that are traded. Who should we start? Shall we start with Duan? We'll start with you now.
Right. Well, so this means I have 5 minutes, doesn't it? You've asked me 2 questions in one go.
Do you want to separate them? Do you want to go for... I don't care. No, seriously.
So I can answer them both at once.
Okay, go for it.
You can come tackle me off the stage when I'm talking for too long. I think your first point, yes, the presence of researchers, students in the field, that does make a difference, and that's actually been observed in terms of reducing illegal activity. I also think, and having worked with many students that would say go from Australia to South Africa or from the United States to South Africa or Namibia, being in that different environment, having to see the poverty that those people live with, the reality of, having elephants come bash down your crops for the season, and then how that changes your mind and talking to those people. I think that's really important. It opens the minds of young students and to other realities. And ultimately in our world today, if we're going to succeed in conserving these species, we need to recognize that we need to have a pluralistic approach. We might personally not like the idea of someone hunting an elephant and consuming it, but there are cultures that live with these animals who have done that for many years. And we need to accept that, and we need to be able to see that and accept that other cultures have different ways of approaching the human-wildlife interaction than perhaps Western countries do. And I think these experiences in other countries can really help with that. In terms of research gaps, I think there are many research gaps. Some of the issues I've started working on with my research group, and I have some students tackling, and I think they're important issues are, where does animal welfare sit in this debate? Animal welfare is such an important issue, and animal welfare organizations are very powerful and vocal in these discussions. And talking to an animal welfare expert at Cambridge University last year, I was surprised to hear that he doesn't work with those NGOs at all because they don't really engage with scientists in the same way conservation NGOs do. But I do think, if we're talking about, we're concerned about the welfare outcomes, we need to understand, what's going to be a better welfare outcome in terms of the science of welfare, which is well established. Another research area that I think is very important is that although CITES says to be science and evidence-based, and as was mentioned to me by one government delegate at CITES last year, when it comes to fish, things that no one cares about, yes, it's science-based. When it comes to elephants, rhino, lion, anything that anyone likes and cares about, it's not science-based at all. And I do think there is a taboo among some of the powerful players in CITES around the idea of even someone wanting to buy ivory. And that actually affects attitudes. And so that becomes very emotional. And I think research can help us unpack that and help us feed it into the policy discussion. So we're open to how emotional we are and what our moral attitudes are towards trading these species that we really like. And also, and a last point there, and I've got a PhD and master's student working on this, is, how do these attitudes towards use vary across different contexts? So yes, in New York, in London, what do people think about trading rhino horn versus the communities who live next to where the rhino occur? Issues on elephants. And I think we're dealing with a very global problem, global supply chains, a globalized world, and we need to understand how different people in these different parts of the world are thinking about this issue and what their perceptions are.
Thank you, Duan. Anna, you have the floor.
Okay. So we talk about the role that conservation biologists should be playing, and clearly there's a need for research. We've talked about the fact that this is very species specific, so we need research. But there's also, in keeping with the theme of this year's conference, of course, a great deal of work that needs to be done on attitudes to species, whether it's local communities who are living with species or communities that are consuming the products of those species. There's interesting work, for example, about how different regimes for turtle eggs have worked in Costa Rica. So that kind of research is really critical because this is all context dependent, it's species dependent. It's not even that you could say for one species it's going to be the same in one community as it is in the other. So if we're really trying to design sustainable systems, conservation biologists, scientists need to be out there working with communities. And to echo what Ezequiel said the other day, I think it was, or maybe I'm mixing sessions, but to talk, but also to listen, that it can't just be top down here. And many of the sessions have touched on this, of course, the role of community knowledge and a back and forth between the participants. That's very important. I think it's also important, obviously I wouldn't be here if I didn't think this, that conservation biologists be willing to engage with policymakers and lawyers. I'm always willing to engage with all of you because essentially the lawyers can give some information about different regulatory systems, about the governance aspects of this that may not be as much of everybody's knowledge base. And everybody has to work together to move forward the goals that we have, which are, of course, conservation. Absolutely, pluralism, right, that's what we need. We need multi-level governance, we need pluralism, we need many voices in the discussion and in the debate, and we do need transparency. So I think one of the problems is that when there are discussions about elephants or rhinos in CITES, there is a lot of science there. But people are coming in with certain positions and certain preconceived ideas, and they're simply trying to use the science as a tool, as a weapon, in fact, rather than a tool. And I think we need multiple studies, transparency, and openness to information that doesn't necessarily fit with your existing assumption. And particularly, my final word would be to question models, to question assumptions that go into those models. Don't hear an argument and think, well, that sounds straightforward, that must be right. That's not what you do on a daily basis, so that's all I would urge all of us to do. Thanks.
Well, we have now 10 minutes, around 10 minutes, to open the session to the audience for questions to any of our two speakers, or interventions. So I have already one question here. Do you have a microphone that we can, thank you.
No.
Okay, it seems that everyone else is waiting, shall I make a start? Okay, I'm based in Asia, and I was at the IUCN Congress last year where we debated the Ivory motion, a very divisive motion which basically engaged countries around the world in whether or not to ban ivory. What we saw is 3 African countries and Japan bullying every other country into trying to allow ivory trade. And every other African country was stating, look, by having it legal in these small number of countries, you're actually draining our resources, and we don't have the funds to be able to protect them into our range states. So your policies in that country are adversely affecting our ability to conserve our species. So in those cases, looking globally, as CITES normally tries to do, might be essential to trying to remedy these conservation issues. A second point, and the major point of this debate, is that of wildlife farming. Now, if you talk to Chris Shepherd at Traffic, he will tell you that he loathes wildlife farming because in most cases it fails to understand the drivers of demand, which is in many cases that wild-caught species are more potent than domesticated versions, and therefore farms only act as a mechanism for laundering. Currently in China, they are trying to farm pangolins, a species that does not breed in captivity. This will solely be a front for trade. The giant salamander is being farmed, and that has led to the extermination of almost the entire wild population. So do you really think that farming in many of these species has a case when it legitimizes demand, and it is shown in many cases to increase that demand, and it means that it is very difficult to control or moderate that trade in actually sustainably farmed animals? So thank you.
Who wants to go for that?
I mean, I agree, so...
I think the points you raise on ivory, I mean, we have a paper coming out on that very divisive issue, hopefully in some months. And I mean, I think that is the debate. I mean, 50% of the COP last October was on ivory. That is a very, very divisive debate, and we need to find a way around it. It's the level of polarization in that debate is harming conservation of elephants and conservation in Africa. And so we need to work around it because both sides are hurling attacks at the other side. And yes, they both do suffer the consequences of the decisions that the pro-trade ones have impacts on the ones that don't want to trade and vice versa. And we need a mechanism to deal with that. With respect to the farming and the laundering, I'm looking forward to receiving these references of where legalization actually increased demand in a scientifically rigorous way, because I've not seen them. But if you have them, please do send them to me. I do know that, of course, yes, if you do have legalized farming, you can have laundering, and that does happen. And as Anne raised, if you're going to think about going down the course of legalization, you need to think very carefully about how you're going to regulate that and the money and the resources involved. For some species, that might be easier than others. And yes, in some cases, especially some species that perhaps the society more broadly care less about, not your elephants and your rhinos, farming is snuck in as, well, this is going to solve the problem, but actually it's not going to. And again, so this is where we need to shift our focus from, let's talk about elephants all the time, and let's actually focus on where the real issues lie.
And actually, I would like to add something, if that's okay. I wanted to add just one other point there, which is the concern as well that a move towards ranching an animal could result in a short-term problem where there's extreme pressure placed on a wild population because of the awareness of sort of coming legalization that may not be controllable. And so we have to think very carefully when we're moving towards a farming approach or a ranching approach, whether we really are making a choice only to conserve that species in a domesticated setting. And if that is what we're going to do, I think we should be transparent about it. If that's what we're saying is the only option for certain species, we need to at least have a discussion and be transparent about it. Thanks.
Then person here, and then Jorge Soberón. Yes.
Okay, I want to ask Anna a question. We think that burning sometimes might be really important, and I've seen huge piles of elephant tusks being burned just to show their seriousness in terms of banning the trade. And I know that there was a time that the rhino horn was like really expensive, such that even museum specimens were being stolen just to be sold. So do you think that by banning, there's going to be scarcity, and then poachers will take higher risk, and then like it's still coming back to the same thing? Like the banning is actually even making it more rather than...
So let me take two scenarios. So one is a scenario where some states are burning their ivory, trying to send a signal, and sort of increasing this idea that there's scarcity and that it's a rare commodity. In an overall global situation where we have basically an incomplete ban. We have domestic markets, we have lack of enforcement. Currently, Chinese tourists can go across the border to Laos and openly buy ivory bracelets and things like that. So we have severe problems with actual implementation and enforcement. In that environment, there is an argument that you're playing into this market scarcity thing. But as an overall strategy of saying that ivory doesn't have a market value, in order to gradually address demand and treat this as no longer a commodity that can be bought or sold, I think it is useful. I do think that if we're going to make a decision that we should have a ban, we should have a ban. If we're not going to have a ban, we should regulate. Right now, for a lot of species, we have some middle ground that is really problematic, and then I think those burning of ivory is sends a more complicated message. But as part of an overall strategy to de-commodify these items, I think it's important.
I will just, I think that's a very good question. Yes, I mean, that would be the standard economic argument. You remove one source of supply, price goes up, therefore there's more incentive to poachers. But I do think that in terms of research needs, ivory burning is a very high profile event, it's elephants, but there's no tracking or research into this. I've worked with some researchers to try and understand what happened after the Kenyan burn last year. But we really, if we're going to take these actions, we need to follow what's happening. Who's getting the message? How's it changing price? How's it changing demand? How's it changing propensity of potential consumers to buy? And so I think, yeah, that's really important to actually conduct that research and monitor what's going on.
So I think one of the issues with hunting is that it's a multi-species activity. So when hunters, in almost all cases, hunters are going into the forest looking for something. Most of the time they'll be shooting something that is small, and they'll either be eating it themselves or just sharing it or selling locally. Occasionally they'll get something a little bit more high value and they'll trade it to an urban center, and very occasionally they might shoot something that's really valuable and trade it internationally. And I think one of the big difficulties is the fact that with this multi-species approach, it's very difficult to design systems where you're not driving the more vulnerable species to extinction, at least locally. And similarly, it's very difficult to come to a type of regulation that is both provides those local people with a source of protein and some kind of rights to food, but also protects those endangered species. It's a question to both of you, I think.
I think it is very difficult. I'll just say as a quick aside, I think the reference to multi-species aspects of this is very important. We haven't talked at all about leakage, about poachers moving in from one thing to another, tiger bone wine to lion bone wine, or now giraffes. So we didn't talk about that, and that is an important piece as well, that research has to look at the whole, all of the species together. I guess, yes, I think there's more research needed. I think this is similar to a lot of research that is needed on, community forest management, and that is already taking place in part because of questions about RED and how RED would be implemented. And I think it's a similar idea that we have to, we want local communities to be able to live in the environment, but we want to somehow figure out how to make sure they're not undermining conservation. It's my best response is we need more research.
So just to, I think that the issue that you raise is a real issue, certainly in many African settings, I'd imagine in this part of the world as well. And whichever strategy you're thinking about applying, be that regulated trade and hunting, or be that a ban, you're facing that challenge. A ban could backfire. Like in some African settings, communities already see conservation as a non-legitimate activity for the rich people, or implemented by the colonizers. Then, another ban, great. Well, I don't care. I'm just going to do anything. In the same, if you regulate and say, well, you can remove this much of this species, but it's not well enforced, you have that problem, and that's why we need to think very carefully about these strategies. Just another research gap that stems from your question and your response earlier. There's a lot of discussion around, well, we need to decommodify things like ivory. Let's do demand reduction, and a lot of resources going into that. And I think not that much research or real sort of transparent evaluation of whether this is possible and in time, and sort of what levels of targets we need to be meeting in the next 5 years to get a sense that this is actually going to work. Because maybe that demand that's been there for 2,000 years is just going to persist. And then we need to be aware of that and adapt our strategies accordingly.
Thank you, Duan. There is only time for one question more. I'll give it to Jorge Soberon here, who asked from the very beginning, and we will need to start closing the session.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to make it brief. Multilateral agreements like CITES are designed and governed, structured and conceived to be negotiations among sovereign parties, states. What's the right way of introducing communities or NGOs which are not sovereign parties and that are much less well defined, etc.? I see the need, but what I don't see is the how.
You're the lawyer.
Yeah, I'm ready to go. So it's true that multilateral agreements, and particularly ones that started, 1973, CITES, are not written with a view to multi-level governance and don't seem to do very much for on-the-ground implementation when you read their text. I think CITES has done a lot to change that, in part because CITES acts as a trigger for resources. We can seriously question some of the resources that flow because they come, through NGOs that are coming from northern state money. But nevertheless, it triggers and facilitates a great deal of capacity building. It is also like really all international environmental agreements, further ahead than many other international treaties in that it does allow for participation of non-governmental organizations, and the groups that go are not all on one side. NGOs come from all sorts of positions. But here's what it could do significantly better. We have a lot of resolutions. The international lawyers debate about whether they're binding or non-binding, but they really do influence how the parties think about the treaty. And again, they facilitate the sort of capacity building efforts. But what we need more of is not just NGOs, but a specific sort of inclusion of local communities, but also more thinking about these regulatory systems and the governance systems. I'm not sure that CITES is the place to do that, right? I think a lot of that already happens under the auspices of the Biodiversity Convention and other things. But yes, it would be better if it was a forum for more voices. But the state, no state is willing to give up its sovereignty. Every state, regardless of whether it's north or south, is unwilling to cede sovereignty, and even to the extent that it doesn't always represent its subnational groups. It's a problem in international law across the board. I think we as conservationists can continually demand better and have a voice to those governments.
If I can just add to that briefly, I think, well, one of the parts of what we were proposing last year was that you could have a requirement, so if you want to start trading a species, CITES has a requirement, you need to have a non-detriment finding. You could have a requirement that's a formal requirement within CITES. If you're going to impose stricter regulations, you need to assess and evaluate the social impacts of those and how you're going to address them. So that would be something that could potentially be agreed to. As I understand, there is an intersessional CITES working group looking at, what form a community voice could take. So perhaps there'll be some way forward. But yes, the constraints that you mentioned and the power that the nation states have, and they want to hold on to that, is a challenge.
Well, thank you. We will now proceed to the closing part of this session. We will set up the 4 questions we had at the beginning, and we will redo your replies to see if there is any swaying in the opinion after this very rich discussion. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Duan, for very stimulating ideas. And the first question, remember, was, do trade bans work, or do they detonate illegal trade that can drive species to extinction? And the answers were 3. A, they do work. B, they don't work. And C was, I don't know enough. I don't have enough information to answer this question. Oh, for some reason it's not showing in this screen. Sorry about that. Yeah, because before it was showing in this screen. I'm really sorry. I thought I was still waiting for it. Okay, we have 25, 25, and 50%. The majority is still unsure, as I personally am.
So C minus.
Question number 2. Millions of people in tropical regions depend on bushmeat and wild foods to meet their calorie and nutrient intake. When this is sourced from endangered species, should existing bans on harvest, trade, and consumption still apply? And we have 2 possible answers, yes and no. Okay, seems to be stabilizing. Now I do have it here, as a matter of fact. On a majority of members of the audience that think that bans should apply to local communities when species are in danger, and around 1/3 that thinks they should not be applied. And for the sake of time, sorry if I'm rushing this, the third question was, is it acceptable to domesticate and farm endangered species ex situ in ranches and zoos with the finality of consuming them? And the answers were A, yes, B, no, and C, it depends on the species. Well, the majority seems to still think, as a matter of fact, I think it has increased. The people that think that it should be case by case, that it does depend on the species. Having done this, I'm going to close this session. It's really interesting. It shows how complex the issue of regulating the trade on endangered species is. But before closing, I would like to invite Tuyeni Wampamba to come here. She's a brain behind the stages that crafted this. And thank you to Yeni for this very, very stimulating discussion. And I want to ask all of you for a big applause for Anna, for Duan, and of course for Tuyeni. Thank you, Tuyeni. Thank you very much. Do you want to say anything in closing, any of you? It has to be seconds.
No, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for chairing, and yes,
Yeah.
thank you for participating.
Yeah.
And again, thank you for an intelligent and stimulating discussion. Thank you.